Hello, this is Bobby Grow again. Welcome to another Always Reforming podcast. In this episode, I want to talk about, once again, provisionism. This is going to be a response to someone else's response to a blog post I wrote in critique of Leighton Flowers' so-called provisionism. And so the response podcast was made to a blog post I wrote by a guy named Eric. He's appeared with Leighton a few times that I've seen on his podcast or vlog with reference to Provisionist soteriology. And so this guy took issue with a blog post I wrote, a lengthy blog post I wrote, where I tried to show how there are similarities between Leighton Flowers' view of fallen humanity and free will, and Pelagius himself, and even more broadly than just Pelagius himself, what developed into what is known as Pelagianism and semi-Pelagianism. So this guy Eric, he reads through my whole blog post almost. I think all of it, actually. So, I mean, I do appreciate people who spend time to engage with something that I wrote, but the way that he interacted with me was misleading, and it feels disingenuous, because basically his ultimate conclusion was that I don't know what I'm talking about in regard to the history, theologically, and that I offer a really weak argument that doesn't establish what I intended to demonstrate by drawing parallels between Pelagianism, and Leighton Flowers' anthropology and soteriology. So he says his basic critique, this Eric guy, and he runs a podcast called Provisionist Perspectives, I think, which him and another guy have tied into a Twitter account they did create, where they're trying to forward Leighton Flowers' idiosyncratic understanding of what he's calling provisionism. But yeah, so anyway, I don't have the technical know-how with podcasting to cut in this guy's podcast, so I could go like frame by frame and respond to him. All I can do here is tell you basically what he said in response to my blog post, and just clarify, as I have on his Twitter account under the link to the podcast, which I just found. Actually, he didn't tell me he did this. He posted, like, I think it was the day before Thanksgiving 2020. I just found it. I was doing like just a blog search, a Google search, just on my name. I do that sometimes just to see if people have reviewed our books, or if anybody's interacted with blog posts I've written, or things like that. So that's what I was doing, and I came across this that way, and so I listened to it, and it's an interesting response, because it's completely, he basically says, I don't understand the history surrounding Augustine, Pelagius, and the developments that obtained between them back in 410. And but the thing that I was pressing wasn't that as much. I did share a synopsis of, or a sketch of, what Pelagius taught from a friend named Nick Needham, who is a professor of historical theology at Highland Theological College in the University of Aberdeen. And he has written a 4-volume series on church history, historical theology. He supervises doctoral students in the area of historical theology where they get PhD'd under him. I mean, and this guy, so I shared Needham some quotes from him just because it's a blog post, and that's what I do. And I ran across this section in my reading of his book, Volume 4, with reference to Pelagius. And so I thought, oh, and I had just been listening to a podcast from Leighton Flowers again on, what he talks about the same things over and over again. So yeah, he was talking about free will and salvation. And so I thought, that seems timely. So I sat down and wrote this blog post, which this guy Eric responded to. But this guy apparently has no training of his own admission, and it's clear. So he did a Google search, and I think he emphasized that he did this Google search because he thinks in doing this Google search that he really showed how incredible Nick Needham and myself are as far as describing what Pelagianism entails historically. And so he did this Google search. And he said, I just did a Google search, and, just doing that, I can show how Bobby's whole argument is fallacious and weak, and he implicates Nick Needham as well, and anybody else who talks about Pelagianism as if it's a thing. This guy apparently thinks Pelagianism isn't a thing in the history of the church. So I don't know who has less credibility, me or him. I would say it's him when it comes to understanding the history. So it's just ridiculous. He comes off as smug, tries to sound like he's being charitable at points, but he's not. That's disingenuous. But my basic thing here is just to clarify that Leighton Flowers, if you were to place Leighton Flowers back into the 16th and 17th century in Protestant Europe, Western Europe, in the Reformation, post-Reformation era, and even the magisterial Reformation period, and if he were to write some pamphlets back then and articulate what he's articulating now by way of podcasting and vlogging, if you were to place him back then, he would be labeled either an Arminian, which back then and even now for many Reformed classical Calvinists, when they say Arminian, they basically mean semi-Pelagian. But Leighton Flowers would be considered a Pelagian by any historical standard, what he is communicating. And so this Eric guy says, I don't understand the history of Pelagius or Pelagianism, apparently, which is absurd. I said in my post, and this guy Eric got hung up on this part of my post is at the end, that the locus of or the primary thing that happened with Augustine and Pelagius was that Pelagius was condemned, and Pelagianism was condemned, the teaching by church councils, and that's 100% true. I don't know. I was not talking about any sort of synod or church council that Pelagius himself attended, per se. I was referring to the Council of Carthage, Ephesus, and then finally the Second Council of Orange. That's what I had in mind. So this guy says, I don't know the history and how when I said Pelagianism and Pelagius was condemned, that's what I was referring to, and that's exactly 100% what happened. That's part of the history of the church, and it's basic, like 101 type stuff if you study church history in that period of time. I mean, everybody knows that. So apparently these guys are so focused on Pelagius himself that they get hung up on these little tiny minutia. And even on the minutia points, this guy's in his response to me and trying to decredibilize me is wrong. I didn't say anything that was historically inaccurate in my blog post whatsoever about Pelagianism or Pelagius himself, or in my correlation between Leighton Flowers and Pelagius' his teaching historically understood. And yes, it's debated on whether or not Pelagius taught this or that. There's inferences that are made in the negative from how Augustine was responding to Pelagius at points. So, that's how we do biblical criticism too. So it's not like it's, making kind of negative inferences from what we do and don't have. Even we can put together, when people talk about the manuscript evidence of the Bible, for example, we have 5,000 manuscripts. Some are actual copies and early copies, but a lot of that is just church father patristic witness as well, from the way that they quoted scripture in their writings, the New Testament. And then you make inferences from there, and you can put all of what they used, and you end up with the canon we have today just from their writings themselves. But my point is, that's how history works. So it's not like shaky history to say that Pelagius taught this or that based on what Augustine wrote in response and critique of Pelagius, especially post-debate Pelagius, and the way Augustine turned as he developed as a Christian in his thinking theologically. I mean, this is how we understand Gnosticism itself. We don't really have a lot of the Gnostic writings, but we know what Gnosticism is from someone like Irenaeus and his response to them. So it's the same scenario with Pelagius and his teaching. Yeah, we might not have first-hand evidence of what these people taught, per se, but that's not how historiography works, per se. If we don't have first-hand, well, then we can work from the second-hand witnesses that we have, using the tools that have been developed to critically reconstruct what somebody believed and taught. So, in Pelagius' case, we have Augustine, and there's others too, but Augustine is a very good source for trying to reconstruct what Pelagius must have taught in regard to free will. I'd refer you to Jane D. Kelly and other patristic scholars who they're pretty credible, and much more credible than this guy doing a Google search to refute me. His Google search didn't refute what I said about the history about Pelagianism being condemned, Pelagius himself being condemned, his teachings as understood by the Council of Carthage, Ephesus, and the Second Council of Orange. We have other people close to Pelagius' time itself. John Cassian picks up on Pelagianism, Pelagius' teaching. It came from somewhere is the point. Even if it didn't come from Pelagius in the way it was developed later, usually things do develop over time. We have the same thing happen with Thomas Aquinas and Thomism. So, his teachings are appropriated by different audiences and developed in certain ways per the needs and constraints of the audience that's receiving those teachings. And then so we get different developments. But in spirit, they're tied it back to the originator of the teachings that have been constructively worked on and developed. So in Pelagius' case, we have Pelagianism, but there's a correlation between what he taught and what is known historically as Pelagianism. So in my blog post, I might not have been careful enough to draw that out, because I assume that most people understand that, but this guy Eric doesn't understand how history works. They don't, and that's the whole point. But then he's going to say that I'm not credible, that I don't have credibility because I don't understand the history, when he in fact is one who does not know the history, and he admits it himself and illustrates that by showing the level of understanding he has by simply doing a Google search. It's really a joke, and it's really hard to take seriously. But that's what these guys do. But they're not. That's why they're not worth engaging with for me anymore, because they're not serious opponents theologically. They don't do the work. They don't think accurately. I mean, it's just silly. This guy didn't even know that I'm called the evangelical Calvinist, but he didn't even do his homework to figure out what that entails. He just presumed that I'm a 5-point Calvinist and all this stuff. It's just asinine kind of stuff. He didn't peruse my blog just a little bit. I have posts. I have right on my header, I have a page dedicated to just introducing what we're about. I say, if he would have opened that page, he would have seen right in the very beginning, I'm not a 5-point Calvinist. I critique that. I critique federal covenantal theology all the time. It's what I'm known for. And he didn't take the time to do that either. So, I mean, I don't know. It's just a joke. So I was going to do a blog post on this, but to me, it just highlights something. It gives him more airtime than he deserves. So I don't think I'm going to do that at this point. Nobody even listens to their podcast by their own admission, by a poll they just took on their Twitter account. Most people didn't even know they had a podcast, him and his friend. It appears they're trying to like grab onto the coattails of Leighton Flowers, who has like 45,000 or 50,000 followers, subscribers or something on YouTube, which is sad, because what he's teaching is bad doctrine. But anyway, it just seems as if these guys they thought that they could ride some of Flowers' coattails, and it's not working, which is good. That's a good thing in my view. So anyway, I just wanted to say something about this. I was going to do a blog post. I'm not now. It's not worth it. And I'm kind of ranting right now too here, which is why I prefer writing, because I don't really have the right editing skills. I'd rather do a YouTube video, but I don't have the right editing skills and tools for that either, or time really to do that properly. So, but still, this will be out there, and it's just further clarification. And I've already said all this to this guy Eric, like I said in the Twitter comments to him, but he knows nobody will see those because it's buried way down. So I know he's not concerned with that, and I don't care what this guy thinks. He's not qualified to determine whether or not I'm credible or not credible. All he did was illustrate he's incredible, and he only illustrated that further by admitting that he just used Google to make his argument, which is against me to say that I'm not credible and don't know the history. That's an absolute joke. So anyway, all right, well, thanks for listening. Bye.